Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Planet Zoo. We're back here in Arcadia and we are back in our wetlands biome today. And here is where we were going to build our beaver habitat. But I've had a slight change of heart and I think I'm going to be putting in a new animal here. Our first big cat. That's right, we're going to be bringing the Jaguar to Arcadia. And I'm quite excited to play around with some of the stuff that we've got going on here because obviously I want to complete and continue the South American theme that we've got going here. So a Jaguar seemed like a more appropriate addition to this area than the beaver. The beavers will move down into the lower section of Arcadia's wetlands district, but I think continuing the South American theme throughout this area is probably the best idea, and then we'll go with the North American theme in the second part of the wetlands, and then it'll kind of spread out on the other side towards an African kind of themed area. Anyway, let's dive in and we'll talk a little bit more about what I want to do with this Jaguar habitat during the speed build. So the first thing to do was to get rid of this path. A lot of pathing has changed within this build and that's just what I expect to happen. As I kind of move into these areas that I've kind of planned out, things are always going to change with the landscape and just how I'm planning out these builds because I do everything on the fly and just see what sticks basically. So the main kind of pull of this habitat is going to be a large Aztec themed temple. So we're going to be borrowing little bits from the prefabs that Planet Zoo's dev team have already created for us. But we are going to put our own twist on it and create our own temple. And how it's going to look is there's going to be a number of staircases going up to certain areas. We're then going to run a guest path all the way through a certain area of the temple so that they can get right up close to our Jaguars. So this beginning build was just the simple framework that I was looking to create, and it does change quite a bit. But it's always good to start somewhere and then you can kind of develop as you go, and that's exactly how I like to do my builds. That's why I don't do any planning, because everything is subject to change. So I went with these. Originally I was going to have 4 staircases on either side going up to one centralized area, which would be the sleeping area for our Jaguars. Unfortunately, this doesn't help with wanting guests to get up close and personal because there's not really anywhere we can run a path. I also wanted to put a dive pool in, given that now the Jaguars, as of I think it was an update that took place quite a while ago, the Jaguars now have their diving mechanics and they will eat from the underwater bait feeder. So I wanted to make use of that and allow our guests to see that diving behavior happening. So we came up with a different plan to have the sleeping area raised up high on this platform. That platform does end up being extended as well so that there's a little bit more space. And at the back of the temple, there's going to be kind of like an area that has sunken or just collapsed in on itself and filled with water. And this area is where we're going to have our dive pool. Then, underneath the actual sleeping area is where our guests are going to be able to come through. That is also going to allow our guests to observe the Jaguars on those shorter platforms with the little staircases going up to them as well, because there'll be windows on the opposite side of those platforms, allowing guests to see the Jaguars interacting with the enrichment items that we place on there. So you can see the basic stonework that we're going for. It's all temple blocks and little supports and stuff, and we just want to run some nice details all the way around. So again, we make adjustments to the staircase as these new ideas come to fruition, and that really helps us to expand the real estate that the Jaguars are going to have access to, as the platforms all end up being extended. As you can see here, we're having to move this staircase, which in turn causes the platform to be moved as well, and giving the Jaguars a little bit more space to move around on that area. Now, the one problem that I have been having is rather than use the main staircase, the Jaguars have been going onto these shorter staircases and doing a large leap onto the midpoint of the larger staircase, which is quite fun to see. Anyway, this is our kind of finished temple structure. There is going to be a larger piece put on the top there, just to give that hard shelter requirement for the Jaguars, giving them somewhere to sleep. But this is our dive pool, and that means we're then going to have to remove all of our water and dig down so that there's enough space underwater for the Jaguars to really introduce that diving behavior. So we dug out a pit here and then ran around a shallower part so that we can still incorporate the American alligator. Potentially that might change, like I've already said. but we are kind of going with the fact that this might actually happen, so we kind of need to take that into consideration when we're doing this build. And as you can see, we start coming in with our detailing work. So we've got bits of crumbling temple that have sunken into the water here, and basically the land is reclaiming this old temple. Obviously, it would be a bit of an eclectic mix to have Old Town in there and then suddenly this, so I would imagine that this was kind of put in deliberately by our staff, and it's all just a bit of a set piece. But I still like to play around with this ruin kind of architecture, especially when you consider that it's been a bit of a recurring theme throughout. But again, playing around with these ruined temple pieces, even like the window, making it look like there's been like maybe like a little treasure hatch there that's been covered over by silt and sediment as the years have gone by, even though this has actually probably just been built recently as part of the zoo. But it's all in the kind of playfulness of creating with the build pieces that we've got and making different uses of them. So I had a lot of fun with this one. And we finished this one off on stream actually, so a lot of the footage here in the early portion of this build you won't have seen, but later on you're going to see the finishing touches that we did live with a number of people, and I'm really pleased with how well that one went. So I'm really looking forward to streaming more Planet Zoo with you guys and having some nice cozy nights building stuff and talking about our favourite animals and all of the other things. Just keep an eye out for the streams if you've not caught one yet, because it's really fun and we have a really good time in them. Lots of chatting happened in the last one, so I was really pleased to see a lot more audience participation in that one, because it saved me having to talk as much. Anyway, this is where we start to put our detailing on the temple. So I played around quite a bit with these really nice decorative pieces that really finish off these builds, because at the moment it's pretty much just temple stone and it doesn't look amazing. It's very one-dimensional. So this is the kind of first steps to fleshing out a build. I talk about this quite a lot, but it is very much like an artist using paints and stuff to create a finished portrait or something. So they start with their base coats, then they come in with some shading and detailing, add colour and more shading, detailing, all of that sort of stuff. And that's just how I like to build my structures within Planet Zoo. So there's a lot of like playing around with bits and pieces here, like we're trying to get this to work. Obviously these larger pieces don't quite fit, so we just leave a little bit of a gap there on either side, and then as you come around here where these little posts take up a little bit more space on the front portion of the temple, they actually fill in the entire gap. And then obviously once we'd completed this, we duplicated it to the opposite side, so that was some nice symmetry going on for the temple itself. And obviously there's a couple of differences on the actual very base of the temple, where on this side you've got it going off into the grass, and then on the opposite side there's a bit more of a ruined structure there, as if there were more rooms to this temple at some point. But again, we need to think about the fact that this probably isn't a very law-friendly build for this area, so yeah, it's all part of the theme that is generated by the staff as they're building it. But what's been really interesting to show in this one is when I put in the guides and stuff. I don't show this a lot, but I put in a lot of kind of basic structure guides so that I've got an area mapped out. And then obviously we had that gap there in between the two staircases, and this is where I wanted to start putting in some different coloured stone. But rather than using the very, very vibrant red of this pillar that we have here, we change it to a little bit more of a soft grey tone, because I felt it blended in a little bit nicer with the environment. I don't want this to be garish and really kind of vibrant. I'd still like to keep those muted tones in the build. So we did make these a little bit of a different colour and then ran them all the way up, and it kind of gives this really nice design aesthetic to the temple, as if these coloured pillars have been deliberately put in place to kind of signify something. And it also covers up the garish looking holes that we have in the environment as well. So there we are, putting in the final colours, and then these structures, struts get moved around onto the other staircases and just merged in with the environment pretty seamlessly. So this was starting to really take shape, and although you're watching it in super fast speed build style, this build I think turned out to be my longest build. And that's probably because the last 2 hours of it were done on stream, so obviously there was a lot of like stops and starts to talk about stuff, but it ended up totaling 7 hours build time. So to cut that down into a hopefully half-hour video, it's taken quite a lot, but there have been a lot of stoppages and like where I've duplicated items and moved them into place, we don't need to show that because it's already been done once. So this one, I was really quite happy with this, using the stone supports to make a custom wall to cover up the hole here, because none of the actual prefab pieces were fitting in here without causing a little bit of disruption and nuisance. Moving into our guest path area, this is where we start making use of those coloured stone support beams to actually add a little bit more colour within the guest walkthrough. Now, also in this area, we're going to be putting in our education boards and speakers and stuff, but they're also going to be dotted around the entirety of this build, because this is a large build with lots of potential viewpoints for guests. Obviously, they can come into this area here, but also there's a big long fence running all the way around the front part that kind of looks out over onto the staff area and the capybara habitat. And then coming back in here with these details, again this time using a little bit of a colour difference just to give it a little bit more of a kind of flash of attractiveness in the guest area. Now, it doesn't particularly matter for the actual Jaguar habitat itself if that's a little bit more kind of muted, but in the guest area I'd quite like to have something a little bit more like vibrant and stand out-ish. And then we brought in these really nice looking decorative blocks and played around with what we were going to put on our, like, as a cap for this area here. And I'd once again started with my tried and tested Arctic wood beams and planks and Australia planks, but none of them seemed to work. And in the end, we went with the conservation cladding slats. We used the thicker beams as opposed to the thin beams and coloured them a dark brown, very similar to the East Asian timber. Just to, I just think it matches the colour quite nicely, but it doesn't stand out so much that it distracts from the actual stonework. And then I didn't want to show you the mess that I was making with pathing and barrier work to create the dive pool, but that's the kind of finished thing that we're going for. We then adjusted the barrier and the staff entrance so that it was a little bit closer to our staff rooms and our actual keeper huts, which we're then going to do in another episode when I go around and tidy things up, because this is probably the limit for that little staff area that we have just outside the capybara pen. So we're going to need to build a brand new staff area for our next set of builds and exhibits. The other thing I want to mention is we're now at a position pretty much where we can start moving our actual exhibits, and here we're also going to need to put in some vendors. Now, because I had a guest path running all the way through the habitat, which wasn't the original idea, I needed to build a staircase on the upper level of the habitat where the jaguars would be sleeping, and give them access to the dive pool here. So once again, we copied the staircases from the earlier part of the build, and also the stonework that we used to fill in the gaps there, where you can just see bare nothingness underneath the staircase. We then played around with some pillars, so what I wanted to actually do is make it look as if there were previously two staircases going down into this pool, as if there was maybe like a treasure room of some description buried here at some point, but it's since collapsed in on itself and then filled up with water gradually over time. And that's why we kind of have this shallow pool there as well. So it might actually be a good idea. Now, I've not actually done this in the build, so you won't see it, but in like retrospect, as I'm recording the commentary, we maybe need to put in like a pump or something that kind of draws water from the outside to fill up this pond, because it's deeper and extends a little bit higher than the actual outside water levels. So it would be good to put something a little bit more industrial, I guess, in there to make it look like this area is being artificially filled to keep the jaguars with that deep water requirement. But here we came in with some ruined stonework and some collapsed floors just to really bulk out the lore of this place, as if this is some sort of temple that has succumbed to the ages and there's buried treasure underneath perhaps, but now the jaguars rule over this and it's their domain. So this collapsed staircase kind of really finished it all off. And later on we come in with a few items of foliage just to really bulk it all out. Of course, the jaguars, you can't really put in the aquatic foliage in here, so we were limited with what we could use with things like water hyacinth and some of the Amazonian lily pads, but that was enough to finish it off. This doesn't have to be completely detailed. Moving on then, we need to create an external barrier for our jaguars on the staff building facing side. And I started with some basic stone structures with some wooden posts that were the exact same colour and style as the border that runs across the viewing area within the temple itself. This was really simple in a very kind of traditional style, with mesh and some overhanging barriers to prevent the Jaguars from climbing up them and escaping. The overhang is it's very much taking inspiration from the likes of Jurassic Park, I guess, so that we have those things in there to stop them escaping. But it was very simple and very classic, shall we say, and I just wanted to get something pretty basic in, because our barriers on this side don't really need to be too dramatic. We want to focus most of the attention on the habitat itself here, so the barriers, they shouldn't really distract people too much. I do this with most of my barriers though. I don't like to create elaborate barriers, but I still like to use the custom ones and create my own every time, because I feel like the basic ones are a little bit too basic for the kind of level of building that we're creating here now. Although sometimes it's good to use them when you're just kind of starting out, and I would always recommend doing that at first and focusing more on your habitat builds rather than creating custom barriers. But every like good builder, or every competent builder, shall we say, should really start working towards making their own customized barriers. And here I just wanted to add an extra bit of filler in between two stone pieces. Then it was time for our favorite part of the build, Rockwork. Yay! So this, we needed to be aware of the fact that the river that covers most of the wetlands biome here runs all the way through, but also that our Jaguar habitat extends into this section of river as well, or I want it to at least. And bearing in mind that we are probably at a stage now in the wetlands biome where we're going to have to put in some vendors and toilets and stuff around about this section, because guests will have walked here from the entrance to this area. So I think the perfect place to put in some vendors would be around the other side of this stonework that we're putting in place. But bear that in mind, because that might change by the time I go to record the next episode. Who knows? But I think it's probably about time we focused on some staff and guest facilities. So we put down a basic structure of rocks there that I want to use to highlight the end of this habitat. And we're going to develop that further later on, but first we need to get in some more barriers. So once again, we use our standard wooden barrier that we've used for the habitat itself, and just pull that across. That's going to stop the Jaguars escaping, but allow the water to travel through unabated. And that's what it's all about for this one. Also, we need to do the same on the other side, where that rockwork goes. So again, these barriers will feature as the water travels through the other side of the rocks. And it's all about just keeping the environment that we've created. We don't want to do too many changes to it, because this water is now set in stone. That's not intentional punnage from me. Anyway, here we are now adding the detail to this rock face, and we're only going to do the side that's facing the inside of the habitat, because I might end up building on top here now, so on a higher level. Kind of where that path is probably where I'm going to put in my new structures and buildings, so there's absolutely no point working on the area on the other side, just in case we decide to then put in some buildings. And it was just a case of building up our rocks bit by bit to really give it some detail and make it, you know, look like it's not just a selection of rocks thrown in with no thought put into it, which is what it starts out as. That's what they always start out as. You put in your basic stuff and then you build on that foundation to create something that looks really like standout-ish and vibrant, and like it's a really nice part of the natural landscape. So using just similar rocks, rotating them, sinking them in a bit, and just seeing what fits in with what. Like, I really like that flat piece that has a little bit of a curve up to one end, but I've always found it difficult to use it. And now that I'm building a structure that's pretty large, you can really make use of every single thing that's at your disposal in the build set. So it's been a really nice change to kind of come in here and make something that's pretty vast in the grand scheme of things. Although by the time we get finished, it looks a lot smaller than it actually is. There's a lot of ground here to cover. I think the habitat size is around about 2,500 square foot. and that's a lot of roaming space for our Jaguars. But once we finish off all of the builds and all of the little sections and montages that we've put in here, it's actually a lot smaller, you'll probably find. So just again finishing off some smaller touches on the rocks here, bringing in these little pillars of cladding to really bulk it all out and give it a little bit more definition. And I'm pretty happy with how it's all looking now. And I think it probably is going to be a really nice place to have some little like guest areas on the other side there with some vendors and some seating areas, or maybe even a restaurant would be quite nice here, overlooking the Jaguar pen. And on the other side, we're obviously going to try and have another animal species in there too. So that would be a really nice thing for them to be able to view both sides while they're eating or something like that. And I wasn't happy with that original rock that we put in place, so we duplicated a little segment from the main Rockwork and put that in place as well. Then a large strangler fig on this side here. And what we could actually do is run a platform up here for the Jaguars to kind of climb all the way up it, but I'll maybe do that another time. I think the climbing platform that we end up putting in is pretty good, and this is just a nice foliage set piece to add in. Now the strangler fig, obviously we extended the roots a little bit so that they kind of come out, and then these end up getting lost when we put all of the other ground foliage in place, but it's not too much of an issue. I just like the fact that they're there. It doesn't really matter if we then cover it up with stuff later on, like we've done here with the scaviola bushes, but we still do get a little bit of root work sticking out. And I don't really like the fact that that strangler fig is just kind of poking out like that at a weird angle without having some definitive support in there. We could, again, extend the roots a little bit further so that they kind of go like way into the landscape, but that's, again, something else for a later build or a later episode. Water hyacinth now to just finish it off and give a nice little bit of definition, and then some coastal mangroves all the way along the shoreline here. I wasn't too sure about that small one that we put in place, so that may get removed at some point as well. The next kind of segment that we want to be working on though is our climbing frame for our Jaguars. And what I wanted to do was have 3 Brazil nut trees in. And then we're going to build platforms in and around the area of this tree. So we just filter everything out so that we've just got the Jaguar's basic enrichment items and stuff. And then we get these climbable platforms and put some climbable logs onto them. We then sink these down into the ground, and then we've got like 3 platforms that we're going to have to make up this entire structure. And at the moment, they don't look too good. And when I finally put in the like bridging pieces as well, they look even worse because there's very little in the way of support and stuff. So I had a basic idea of how I wanted this all to go. And the one criticism I have of this build, having now finished it, is these are a little bit lacking. I would like to maybe come back and add a bit more detail on these to make them look a little bit more supported against the landscape, because they are essentially just floating. And although I did end up adding some supports and like bridges on the actual woodwork there, we put in a couple of rope pieces so that it looks like there's some sort of like framework to them. They still look a little bit like they're floating, and I didn't want to put supporting struts right in the middle because I thought it interfered with the habitat too much. So in summary, it's not as I hoped, really. And I'm struggling to get the words out because it's still good and I'm still happy with it. I just think there's more we could do with this, and it's the one thing I'm pretty critical about regarding this build. But we came in and we wanted to cover the platform bases with a little bit of foliage. So giant rhubarb makes an appearance, a nice little forest of it around and about the platform there, with a couple of elephant ear plants, and we then brought in scaviola to finish it all off. Again, this is a heavily featuring plant in this biome because it just looks really cool. We could use tick seed as well. The great thing about the Jaguars is they have multiple biomes that you can add in. So we can play around with grassland stuff, we can play around with temperate stuff, but I really want to try and stick to the tropical theme. I don't actually think the Brazil nut trees are part of a tropical theme, but it's nice to have them because their trunks are really large and they don't actually have any root work to be seen, so you can sink them down into the ground pretty nicely. And then again, we come in with the cordycean plants and a couple of custard apple trees just to add a little bit more depth in the foliage. And then getting back over to our little stream here, we use the common reeds in the strand form to just add a little bit more of a pop of colour to this otherwise boring area. But you can see it's now starting to get a really lush coverage of foliage, and the great thing about the jaguars, as I've mentioned with a couple of the other animals we've got at our disposal in the tropical areas, they can have up to 100% coverage of foliage, so there's lots of space for them to hide. Got to remember, while the jaguars don't tend to get stressed, the cubs do. So if they aren't able to hide and find a place to escape our guests, which is going to be quite difficult given that this entire habitat is surrounded and there's not a lot of space for them to hide, they can get stressed pretty easily. So we may need to come in and put some of those signs in that tell guests to be quiet and not make too much noise in and around the habitat. So that's something else we can consider, because you won't get to see me putting in the habitat barriers and well, education boards and stuff. I've left that out, but they are put in place at the end of the video, so you should see little glimpses of them during the tour. Now, this part of the build actually took place on the stream, and you can watch the video on demand for a slower version of this where you'll be able to see absolutely everything that goes on in the finishing touches of this build. But basically, I wanted to put another roof segment on there so that our jaguars had some hard shelter to sleep under at the end of a day, and it's somewhere where they can actually completely escape our guests and have some much needed and much deserved privacy. But the roof of the temple needed a little bit more work as well, and although this isn't a piece that any animal or guest is going to be able to get to, we do need to make sure that we make it look good. It's a set piece, so it's really going to finish off the temple, so it still needs to look attractive and like we've put a little bit of time into it. And I actually put a lot of time into it. Because I was doing this on stream, I think this took in total around about 2 hours to actually complete, and for such a small area as well, it seems like a long time. But I wanted to make a nice little lip all the way around the roof here, and that was done using the temple stone supports, which we then sunk into place and made sure we had duplicated on either side. Then we put in a couple of these decorative items on the corners just to really finish it off. Moving on to the next bit, I added an extra 1 meter high level, which we then added a decorative layer onto the outside of the basic 4 meter stone wall pieces. I then removed the stone wall pieces because what I was left with was a nice little shell. Then we raised the floor a little bit more, and that gave us a little bit more of a platform to work on when we build the final roof piece of the temple, which is something that I was really excited about. I think it's going to be a really nice little finishing touch, and I was really happy with the outcome. So the next phase of the development of this was to actually put a definitive roof piece on that would finish the height of the temple. It's looking a little bit flat, so we needed to create something on the top here that would essentially be the roof, but also had a little bit more extravagance around it. And what I wanted to do was mimic some of the blueprints that are already in the game. So these are blueprints that you can research through your mechanics that the dev team have incorporated into the game in advance of like an expansion work like coming out. So this was from the South American pack, and I basically took a lot of inspiration from some of the temple kind of structures that they've already put in place, but with my own little twist on it. So here it was about, once again, creating walls using the supporting pillar blocks and adding doorways, and these kind of have like a little bit of a natural step up. And rather than creating my own entranceway, I then borrowed the entrances from the actual blueprinted pieces and used them instead. It was just a way of saving a little bit of time during the build process and making sure that I could continue with the rest of the build unabated and skipping something that would actually take a lot of time. So here they are put in place. And then I just wanted to match my walls up to the incline of that stone temple entranceway so that we had a finished piece right on the top of our temple, and I think it looks really cool. Obviously there's a couple of adjustments to be made with the doorways, and I eventually added doorways on the middle points of the walls as well, so there was this really cool looking area right on the top of our temple. And then it was once again just making light adjustments to the stonework and the walls here, adding in extra pieces to fill in any gaps. And I didn't want these things to be too close together, so it was quite nice that there was a little bit of a gap in between each piece. And eventually we build it all the way up and add a little bit of a finishing touch on the top. And then it was time to decorate this temple with foliage. And this is where things really start to come together. And I was really happy with how all of this turned out. So let's move on. Once again, scaevola bushes, and we want to make it look like this is growing right over the walls of the temple. And this is where you kind of really make those adjustments to differentiate your build in certain areas. So here we have this scaevola pouring over into the habitat itself that will probably interfere with the guests if they continue to grow. I eventually realized that moving my roof caused a little bit of an issue, so we eventually dropped all of that down just to give it a bit more of a ceiling and stop the scaevola bushes poking through. Once that was put in place, we could continue with our foliage work. And again, it was a case of moving these bushes around, but always making sure that there was kind of a natural flow of it. And we also need to have a reason for these being up here and how they've actually grown, because they wouldn't just be cultivated on top of a stone temple that staff don't have access to. So it's not like this is something that could just be planted. So that was something that I had in the back of my mind as I was developing the build further. But we duplicated and moved another swathe of it into position, and then just made a few light adjustments on the foliage here, just so that it looked different from the opposite side. But that again allowed us to really make some nice little pops of colour on the top of this temple and give it that really overgrown feel. Then we used the liana vines, curtains coming in and just dropping into the entrances of this temple. Obviously there's not really going to be anything going on in this area, so we kind of need to give it some sort of purpose other than it's the roof of our building, so that's just what it is. So decorating it with strangler fig roots and stuff was a really nice touch, and I think maybe we could put some sort of light on the top of it so that it looks like there's like a, I don't know, like an eternal fire pit on the top. Something similar to what we've already done in the build, but on a larger scale. We didn't actually do any nighttime building on this episode, so you won't actually see any of the lighting work. And I think maybe we'll do a full episode on lighting and stuff at a later date, because we've obviously got 4 habitats now in this section that don't have any lighting in them really. So we will need to kind of do those little bits and pieces just to finish it all off. Now here I wanted to put in the reasoning for this growth of scaevola. And you can see we've already added a few mossy rocks on the top of the temple here. And that's because we've had a little bit of a cave in on this roof. And that is why we've started getting this ingress from water. Moss has then started to grow, and as the kind of natural photosynthesis, and it's not photosynthesis, natural reproduction of plants goes, as seeds get carried by the wind, they kind of come in and it deposits the seeds within that moss, which has then had silt and stuff deposit as the wind has kind of picked up, dropped it on, it's gotten wet, it's dug into the ground, and then our scaevola has been given the perfect environment to grow on top of the temple. So we put in a few fallen rocks in there as well, just to indicate it, and then one little bit of lighting that we did, we put in a little bit of fire pit. And I wanted to put these fire pits on the little plinths that are on the front-facing side of the temple. So this was really simple. We used the African fire pit. We stuck a big South American lantern in there so that it was flaming. And then we had the nice embers from the fire pit in there as well. But we had to hide stuff because we don't want that African theme to interfere with the South American theme. We then brought in some bamboo, which we coloured, again, the same brown as the other wood that we have in this habitat. We then put those into place. I wasn't too happy with it at various stages, so this did take a little bit of time and a little bit of adjustment. And once we had that finished off, we then put in our bamboo posts because a lot of the stones that we were playing around with didn't seem to work. And I didn't really want to use bamboo, but it seemed like the only thing that we could put in because I don't want to use any metal in this habitat. To use it now would be a bit silly, and we'd then have to go back and find other ways to put in metal, so it just didn't make sense. And using the bamboo it just gave us that little nod to woodwork and stuff, and the actual bamboo that is used within the South American biome. And then more liana vines just to finish off the lower levels of this temple, using the large thicker ones and then some of these smaller curtains just at various intervals throughout the habitat, light rotations and a lot more work, and we were just about finished. So as this one closes out and we get ready for the tour, I want to thank you all for your time this week. Thanks so much for watching this episode. It's been a big one and a lot has happened, but it's also probably been my most detailed habitat and most in-depth habitat. It's certainly taken the longest period of time and a lot of thought. And I'm really glad that a lot of you dropped by the stream to see this one get finished off. It was nice to have your input and your encouragement. It certainly made the build process a lot easier. When you're making these videos, it does take a long time, and it becomes a little bit of a grind especially when you're doing those really fine details like we're doing here in the underwater segment, just putting in a few more fallen rocks and stuff and little finishing touches, which we then came around and, like I mentioned earlier, put in our water hyacinths after doing a little bit of terrain decoration just to finish it all off. There's the water hyacinth going in, and then we put on the top some finishing touches of Amazonian water lilies. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the tour. I will see you guys next time. Bye bye.